Today we're going to talk about worship. I'll just come out and say it. No, I'm not going to disguise it in any way, but we're going to talk about worship. And I think when we say that, we can think of many things, and we would think of this worship service right here, and maybe we think of worship services that we've gone to all our lives, or whatever they may be, or where we grew up, and all that kind of stuff. But it's good because I think even if you're here for the very first time, you've come this morning. This is called a worship service. Even if you haven't missed a Sunday since you were baptized, you know this is a worship service. This is why you're here. This is a worship. So we've had many different. I think we can, if we're thinking of all these worship services that we've been in, we can think of worship services that were good, that were moving, and we can also think of worship services that were like, and maybe we fell asleep in. Maybe we were there. I always had one guy in Kentucky, and it was like 5 minutes into it, I knew I'm like, you want me to get a pillow for him, but he would always be out, so that was fine. But maybe we've been to worship services that we say are too long. Maybe we've been to worship service that we say are too short. And I know now all of you are saying, wait a second, there's no such thing as a worship service is that too short. But maybe we've been to these things. Maybe we've been to the worship services that are too loud or too soft or too old or too new and all this stuff, and too big and too small. We've been worship services all over the place. And so maybe you're thinking of it, maybe you're like, what are you talking about? I thought this was the only worship service in the world right here. But no, but we have all these different things. And worship services also bring up memories. They bring up memories of who we sat next to growing up, or maybe sitting next to mom and dad and hearing them sing hymns and doing this kind of stuff where it's very sentimental, But worship is important. Worship is important. Especially this. And some of you may be saying, pointing out your theological caps and saying, well, worship is much bigger than just this. And I would say you're absolutely right. Because we are reminded of Romans 12:1. We're reminded of Romans 12:1 where it says that, where is it? I thought I did a good job, but I didn't. Okay. Romans 12:1 where it says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. So we read that and we understand that we're called to be living sacrifices, that everything we do is supposed to be worship to God. Everything. Everything that we do is supposed to be worship to God. And that's good. We need to understand that. But this morning, I want to focus on this right now. The weekly occurrence that we have where we gather together to worship God. Where we gather together with our community, with friends, with neighbors, with acquaintances, with whoever walks in these doors. That's what I want to focus on this morning. Worship in that context. Worship as a weekly occurrence that we go about doing. So, we understand that worship, we're living sacrifices. That's a whole other sermon. But this right now, what are we doing right now in worship? What are we doing right now in worship? And so I think the best way to look at that is going into the history of worship. And we can look all the way back. We can look all the way back to David, and he has the harps, and he's singing, and he's praising. We can look all the way back to Adam and Eve, how they just had communication with God, walking in the garden with God. They were worshiping God. And we see it develop over time. And we sort of see it develop a little bit better when people start writing stuff down and putting it in history books. And we see this thing, and it's always good because I think there's always been scripture readings. And there's always been some kind of creed. It's like last week. Last week we said the Apostles' Creed. The early church fathers and mothers came up with that. They've been saying it for years, in different languages, of course, but they've been saying it for years. So we go all the way back to the early church with Paul and Peter going around and getting people to worship in in their small houses and just worshiping God in any way. And then we begin to see it develop, and we have these chants, that people were chanting. They're chanting sayings, they're chanting songs, whatever it is they're chanting. And maybe, Gregorian chants. Maybe you've heard of that before. Well, they're named after Pope George, So they name stuff after George, or they name stuff after popes, So, right, Eggs Benedict. The Pope, Eggs Benedict. Anyway, never mind. Keep up on your Catholicism, everybody. But anyway, but we have that as it develops. We have this idea of worship is good, and it keeps changing. And so often, the biggest change that occurs is usually through music. is usually through music. And so these chants then get a little bit more complicated. They turn into the things called hymns where there's people singing different parts and doing different parts. It gets so complicated, and then they say, well, maybe we should bring in this instrument called an organ. Maybe we should bring this thing in, and people are like, well, the people, they're like, well, you young kids and your organs, bringing in these fancy instruments, you guys with your open-toed sandals and long hair, bringing in organs. I don't know. Never mind. I don't know. But anyway, then they brought in these organs to help make the worship more full and help do the things that they need to be doing in worship and song. And then, and the amazing thing is then we also see that like Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, they were working for the church. They were developing these amazing symphonies. They were developing these amazing music masterpieces for worship. For worship. They were, and the amazing thing about this is, you don't have to know a thing about classical music, but you could say those three names. The amazing thing is that helps you see what an impact that you had, that the worship service had on the culture around it. At that time. But then we go into with the Wesley brothers, John and Charles Wesley, the founders of the United Methodist denomination, and we see that they take bar hymns and they turn them into hymns. They bring their theological knowledge and they put it into a bar song. And so then people can relate to that. So that when they're walking down the street, they're humming a song, a tune that's familiar to them, but they're thinking of these theological words that John and Charles Wesley have written down. And so we see here, with Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven, how they influenced the culture. And then we see with the Wesley brothers, who, by the way, is no relation to the Jonas brothers. I don't know if any of you, the parents with little kids, are laughing. Anyway, our kids. Yes. And then, but how they are engaging the culture by using something that's familiar to the culture. And so that carries into what worship is. Worship is this idea that we have, how we reach out to God, but we see the close line that worship has with culture. Because as worship has developed over the years, it has always been about engaging the culture that it's presently in. Worship has to engage the people, engage us where we're at. That's what it's about, because we want to communicate with God. We want to make sure that in our language that we are able to rejoice in God. So there's that fine line between culture and worship. How powerful worship can be to influence the culture, and how we can be effective with worship to go and use something in the culture to then get the message out, to be able to help people praise God in a comfortable way. So that's pretty interesting. Today's church, we see things of this, and something that I was reminded as I was doing this was Rick Warren. He's the sort of a big Protestant figure right now. He's the guy who interviewed the two president candidates to see what were their views, what their political views were. But he was that guy. He was on the front of time. He's that kind of guy. But he started the church called Saddleback out in California. So but something when I read his first book I think it was his first, maybe not his first book, but Purpose Driven Church. And what he wrote in that is when he was developing this church, he sent out a survey. And one of the questions on that survey was what radio station do you listen to? And when they got all that information back, when they gathered in, they realized that in their area, the people listened to this type of music. And so what they did was that they developed their worship service around this style of music. Now they didn't play that music, but they developed a band and they developed this kind of music around that. It's just how worship is supposed to engage the culture that it's presently in. How cool is that?